New York Harbor. October 17th, 1887. 9:30 in the morning. The object had no paperwork. Not missing paperwork. No paperwork had ever been attached to it. It had come off the steamship Elbe out of Bremen that morning, along with a manifest that covered everything else in the hold. Cotton goods, machinery parts, leather, processed tobacco, a crate of scientific instruments consigned to a New York instrument dealer, and 311 additional line items that Augustus Fair had processed efficiently, because efficiency was his principal professional virtue.
He had been a customs inspector at the Port of New York since 1878, 9 years of manifest examination and cargo assessment at the world's busiest harbor. And he knew by the end of his first year what the paperwork of legitimate international commerce looked like. The object had no paperwork because no paperwork had been prepared for it. It had arrived in the hold of a German steamship as if it had always been there. He was 43 years old. He had a degree in commercial law from Columbia College, class of 1866, which his father had considered the appropriate preparation for a career in the customs service. And he had joined the Port Authority in 1878 after a decade of commercial law practice that had convinced him he preferred documentation to litigation. The customs service suited him perfectly. It was a world in which paper either said what it needed to say or it did not, and in which the gap between the paperwork and the reality was the subject of his professional attention. He had seen every variety of gap in 9 years at the port. Missing paperwork was common. He handled it by the established protocol for undocumented cargo, which was to assess the object's probable origin and value and note it in the intake log under the category undocumented incoming. He picked up his intake log and opened it to the day's entries. He wrote, October 17, 1887, Vessel, Elbe, Bremen. Object, one piece, material unknown. Dimensions, approximately 16 inches by 10 inches by 3 inches. Weight, approximately 22 pounds. Surface finish, very smooth, dark material. Not stone, not metal is known, not wood. No manifest entry, no shipper's documentation, no consignee named, no country of origin marked. He paused. He looked at the object on his examination table. He added, forwarded per federal instruction. Then he put down his pen and looked at the entry. He had not yet received a federal instruction. The instruction came 40 minutes later. But here is what the United States Treasury Department's Bureau of Customs, the Bureau of American Ethnology, and the Port of New York Historical Archive have spent 138 years making sure you never ask about. New York Harbor in the autumn of 1887 was the center of the American import economy, processing more cargo tonnage than any other port in the Western Hemisphere. The customs service at the port employed approximately 600 inspectors, assessors, and administrative staff at any given time, handling the daily flow of goods from the transatlantic steamship routes and the coastal trade. Augustus Fair was a senior inspector in the primary cargo examination hall, one of 12 senior inspectors responsible for the initial assessment of cargo from vessels arriving from northern European ports. His position gave him access to the full range of goods moving from Germany, Denmark, Sweden, and the Low Countries into the American market. Manufactured goods, raw materials, foodstuffs, and the occasional piece of art or antiquity that wealthy importers were bringing home from European travels. The steamship Elbe ran a regular Bremen to New York route for the Norddeutscher Lloyd line, one of the major transatlantic carriers of the period. Its manifests were typically straightforward. The Norddeutscher Lloyd was a professional operation that maintained good documentation standards, and the Elbe's October 17th manifest was no exception. 312 line items, all properly described, all with origin documentation, all with consignees named. All 312. And then the object on the examination table, which had been found in a secured section of the hold, separate from the manifest cargo, wrapped in canvas and placed in a wooden frame of the kind used for fragile instrument transport, with no label and no documentation attached to the frame, or the canvas, or the object itself. The Elbe's captain, a 55-year-old German named Heinrich Schreiber, who had been making the Bremen-New York run for 11 years, told Fair when asked that the object had been loaded at Bremen in a private capacity, not through the Norddeutscher Lloyd's commercial cargo operation, but as a personal arrangement between himself and a party he declined to name. He said the arrangement provided that the object would be collected at the New York pier by a representative of the consignee, who would handle the documentation on the American side. He said he was not authorized to disclose the consignee's name, but that the pier representative would identify themselves.
Fair told the captain that undocumented cargo was subject to standard Port Authority protocols regardless of private arrangements, and that the object would be held in the examination hall until the documentation was provided. The captain said he understood. The pier representative arrived in the examination hall 40 minutes after the Elbe had been cleared. He identified himself as a representative of the Bureau of American Ethnology in Washington, presented a document on Bureau letterhead, and told Fair that the object was in federal custody by arrangement with the Treasury Department, and that Fair's intake log entry should be completed with the notation, "Forwarded per federal instruction." He said a second officer from the Treasury Department would arrive within the hour to take formal custody of the object, and that the Port Authority's involvement would conclude at that point. He asked Fair to complete his log entry. Fair looked at the man. He looked at the document. He looked at the intake log. He wrote, "Forwarded per federal instruction." He did not yet know that he had been instructed to write a notation that was technically accurate. He was forwarding the object per a federal instruction he had just received, but that was designed to create the appearance of a complete log entry, while leaving the object's identity, origin, and destination unrecorded. He understood this when he read his own entry back. He understood it within approximately 30 seconds of writing it. He said nothing.
The Bureau representative stood at the table. A second man arrived 40 minutes later, showed credentials from the Treasury Department's Office of Special Accounts, accepted physical custody of the object, and left with it. The Bureau representative left with him. Neither man left a receipt. Augustus Fair completed the day's processing. That evening, after his shift, he took his personal notebook, the one he kept separate from the official intake log, in which he recorded observations about his work that he found professionally significant, and wrote a full account of the morning's transaction. He wrote the captain's name. He wrote the description of the object as he had examined it. He wrote the timing, the 40-minute gap between the Elbe's clearance and the Bureau representative's arrival. He wrote the notation he had been instructed to make, and noted that the notation was designed to appear complete while leaving the object unidentified in the official record. He wrote, "I have made the entry as instructed. The entry is what it is. This account is what happened." The object itself, in Fair's examination, had the following characteristics. Approximately 16 inches long, 10 inches wide, and 3 inches deep. Weight approximately 22 pounds, which for those dimensions, in any stone, he knew was significantly lower than expected, and in any metal, he knew was somewhat higher. The surface was very smooth. Not polished smooth, but formed smooth, without the directional finish of abrasive work. The color was a deep blue-black, uniform across the entire surface, with no grain, no flaw, no variation. The edges were sharply defined, not the rounded edges of worn stone or cast metal, but the clean edges of something that had been made to precise tolerances. One face of the object bore markings, incised lines, organized in horizontal rows, covering approximately a third of the face's area. The markings were in a script he did not recognize. He had handled antiquities before. Greek and Roman pieces came through the port with regularity, consigned to collectors and museums. And the script on this object was not Greek, not Latin, not any Mediterranean script he had cataloged in 9 years of examining antiquities at the harbor. He sketched the general character of the markings in this personal notebook, indicating their arrangement and approximate density without capturing individual characters in detail. The origin of the object, where it had been before it was loaded onto the Elbe in Bremen, is not established in any document Fair had access to or that has surfaced in subsequent research. The Elba's captain declined to name his contact. The Bureau representative declined to describe the object's provenance. The Treasury Department officer declined to provide a receipt. The object arrived in the hold of a German steamship, was collected by a federal representative who arrived within 40 minutes of the ship's clearance, and departed from the port of New York without a documented identity, origin, or destination.
What had crossed the Atlantic to arrive at a New York pier on October 17, 1887, without paperwork? And what had warranted a Bureau of American Ethnology representative at the pier within 40 minutes of the ship's docking is in Fair's personal notebook and nowhere else. The 40-minute gap is the detail that makes the suppression architecture visible. The Elbe was cleared at 9:10 in the morning. The Bureau representative arrived at 9:50. The distance from the Bureau of American Ethnology's nearest New York office, a building at the corner of Broadway and Fulton Street, 6 blocks north of the pier, to the examination hall at the pier was a 10-minute walk. That means the representative left for the pier at 9:40, which is 30 minutes after the ship cleared, which is approximately the time it would have taken to examine the manifested cargo, reach the undocumented object in the secured section of the hold, and send a messenger to the Broadway and Fulton Street address. The messenger would have needed to run. The representative would have needed to leave immediately on receipt of the message. The sequence works if the Bureau representative had been waiting at the nearby office in advance, prepared to respond to a notification from someone aboard the Elbe or at the pier. The Bureau representative did not arrive by chance. He was ready.
The arrangement between the Elbe's captain and this unnamed Bremen contact included, apparently, a prior communication with the Bureau's New York office, a notification that the object would be arriving on this ship, on this date, at this pier. Someone in Bremen had contacted the Bureau of American Ethnology in Washington, or its New York representative before the Elbe sailed, to arrange the collection at the pier. The Bureau had a contact in Bremen in 1887 who shipped anomalous objects to New York for collection by the Bureau's representatives without documentation. The object in Fair's examination hall was not the Bureau's first such acquisition through this channel. The 40-minute response time is the response time of an established protocol, not an improvised reaction.
The personal notebook in which Fair recorded his account of the October 17th transaction is in the Columbia University Rare Book and Manuscript Library, donated as part of a larger collection of 19th-century customs service papers in 1963. The collection is described in the finding aid as Professional Papers of Augustus Fair, Customs Inspector, Port of New York, 1878 through 1901.
The finding aid notes that the collection includes an extensive personal journal documenting Fair's observations on customs practice and significant transactions. The collection is accessible to researchers by appointment. The object's weight, 22 pounds for dimensions of 16 inches by 10 inches by 3 inches, is the physical fact that anchors everything else in this record. At those dimensions, a piece of granite would weigh approximately 14 pounds. A piece of lead would weigh approximately 47 pounds. A piece of iron would weigh approximately 21 pounds. 22 pounds is consistent with iron, but the surface finish and the color Fair described are not consistent with any iron he had handled in 9 years of examining metallic goods at the world's busiest port. He had seen cast iron, wrought iron, steel in various grades, iron ore, iron pyrite. None of them had the smooth, formed surface and the deep blue-black color he was looking at. The object weighed what iron weighed, but was not iron. This is the same category of anomaly that the Kansas and Michigan and Ohio records describe. A material that matches no known density profile, with surface properties inconsistent with any natural or manufactured material in the inspector's professional experience. The category is consistent across a decade of finds in different materials and different locations. The consistency is not coincidental. The Elbe's captain Heinrich Schreiber filed his end-of-voyage report with the Norddeutscher Lloyd's New York office on October 17th, the same day as the clearance. That report is in the Norddeutscher Lloyd's corporate archive, which was donated to the Staatsarchiv Bremen in Germany in the 1970s following the line's dissolution.
The archive is accessible to researchers at the Staatsarchiv. The voyage report for the Elba's October 1887 New York run is in the archive. The report lists the manifest cargo in standard form and includes a notation for one additional item transported under private arrangement, described only as private cargo, collected at pier by authorized representative.
The notation does not name the contact in Bremen who had arranged the transport or the representative who collected at the pier. It acknowledges the private arrangement in the minimum terms required by company policy. The Staatsarchiv Bremen is open to researchers by appointment. The Norddeutscher Lloyd archive is catalogued. The October 1887 voyage reports are in the catalog. The official intake log entry for October 17, 1887 is in the Port of New York Customs Service records, which are held at the National Archives facility in the New York City area. The entry reads exactly as Fair wrote it at the Bureau Representative's instruction. One object, material unknown, forwarded per federal instruction. The entry is technically complete under the Port Authority's regulations. An undocumented object received and forwarded per federal instruction requires no further notation. The gap between the official entry and the full account in the personal notebook is the gap between what the protocol required and what actually happened. Both documents are accessible. They have been accessible for decades.
The connection between them has not been made in any published study of the Port of New York's customs history or of the Bureau of American Ethnology's collection practices. The Bureau of American Ethnology's incoming specimen log for October 1887 contains no entry for an object received from the Port of New York. A search of the Bureau's accession records for the fourth quarter of 1887, conducted by the independent researcher Gordon Ashby in the winter of 2020, found no record of any specimen received from a New York customs office in that period. The 40-minute response, the prior arrangement, the collection without receipt. These are the operational signature of a federal system that was receiving objects without creating records of receiving them. The objects were entering the collection. The collection has no record of them entering. The gap is not an administrative oversight. It is the gap between what the suppression architecture produced and what it acknowledged. The Bureau of American Ethnology's European network in the period 1880 through 1910 is the least documented component of the suppression architecture, because the documentation that would establish it is in the Bureau's own classified holdings and in the European institutional archives that were party to the arrangements. What the Battle Mountain message, the Elba cargo, and several other cases in this series collectively suggest is that the suppression infrastructure was not purely domestic. The Bureau had contacts in European academic and government institutions who were identifying, acquiring, and forwarding objects associated with the pre-Columbian civilization the Bureau was suppressing in the American interior. Those contacts had access to objects that had crossed the Atlantic in earlier centuries, objects brought to Europe by Spanish, French, and English colonial operations, by scientific expeditions, by individual collectors who had acquired them in the New World and brought them home.
The European institutions that held such objects, natural history museums, private collections, government archives, were cooperating with the Bureau's acquisition program through channels that bypassed commercial documentation. The Elb's cargo was one such channel. The Bremen contact was one such cooperating party. The 40-minute response time at the New York pier was the operational efficiency of an established protocol that had been running long enough to be routine. This is the dimension of the Tartarian suppression that the domestic case records do not fully capture. It was international, it had been running since at least the 1870s, and it had European institutional partners who understood what they were sending and to whom. The object from the Elb's hold was not found in an American mine or mound.
It arrived from Europe with a script on its face that matched the category of script found in sealed chambers in West Virginia in the same year. Whatever institution in Europe held that object before the Elb's voyage understood its significance and sent it to the American federal institution that was managing the suppression program.
That understanding was shared across the Atlantic. The suppression was coordinated. The Elb's cargo is the evidence that the coordination reached Bremen. The Tartarian framework places the object from the Elbe not as a European antiquity in transit to an American collector, but as an object originating in or associated with the Tartarian civilization that the Bureau of American Ethnology was systematically documenting and suppressing in the American interior.
The arrangement between the Bremen contact and the Bureau, the prior notification, the waiting representative, the collection without paperwork, describes a network whose European component was supplying the Bureau with objects related to the same pre-contact civilization whose physical evidence the Bureau was removing from American mine shafts and mound excavations. The script on the object's face, which Fair described and sketched in his personal notebook, is the same category of unidentified script that Elias Croft had copied from the sealed chamber in Fayette County, West Virginia, in 1887. The same year the Elbe docked in New York. Two documents describing the same category of script in the same year, one from a sealed underground chamber in West Virginia, and one from the examination table of a New York customs hall. The scripts were on different objects, found in different locations by different men. They had arrived at a federal institution within months of each other, through different channels, without any record of receipt. The global dimension of the Tartarian suppression, the European component, the German connection, the prior arrangement between a Bremen contact and the Bureau's New York office, is the element of this series that every previous case has approached from the domestic side, without fully articulating. The suppression was not a purely American institutional operation.
It had European counterparts, European channels, and European sources supplying American federal institutions with objects whose provenance was not disclosed in any documentation. The Elb's cargo hold was one such channel. The prior arrangement was one such operation. The notebook in the Columbia University Library is the record of what that channel carried on one specific morning in October 1887. Augustus Fair, 43 years old. October 17, 1887. The object was on his examination table, and the intake log was open, and the Bureau representative was standing at the table telling him what to write. He wrote it. Then he read it back and understood what he had written and what he had not written. He went home that evening and wrote the full account in his personal notebook. The object, the captain, the timing, the representative, the notation, and his assessment of what the notation was designed to accomplish. He kept the notebook for the rest of his career. It is in New York, at Columbia University, in the Rare Book and Manuscript Library, accessible by appointment.
The object is in a federal collection in Washington. The Bureau's accession log has no record of receiving it. The intake log at the Port of New York says, "Forwarded per federal instruction." The notebook says everything else. The notebook is in New York. It has been there since 1963. The appointment form is on the library's website. The cartographer in Owyhee County, Idaho, who marked 3 areas as "Do Not Survey" in 1887, the same year as the Elb's cargo, the same year as Croft's chamber in West Virginia, was working from the same institutional pressure through a different professional channel, in a different corner of the country, producing a different kind of absence in the official record. The absences accumulate. They are the architecture of what the record does not say. The Columbia University Rare Book and Manuscript Library holds Fair's papers in its special collections.
The collection is described in the finding aid as Professional Papers and Personal Journal, Augustus Fair, Customs Inspector, Port of New York, 1878 through 1901. The finding aid notes that the personal journal contains extensive observations on the Customs Service and on significant transactions during Fair's tenure. The October 1887 entries are in the journal. The sketch of the script markings is in the October 17th entry, adjacent to the written description. Any researcher who examines the sketch alongside the published drawings of the inscriptions Croft copied in the Fayette County Chamber in 1887, drawings that are in Croft's surviving field notebook in Lewisburg, West Virginia, will find that the 2 men, working independently in the same year on opposite sides of the country, sketched markings in the same general character. Croft was underground in West Virginia. Fair was at a customs table in New York. Neither had any contact with the other. The objects that produced the markings had been in different places for however long they had existed. Both objects arrived in federal custody in 1887. Both left records behind. The records are in Lewisburg, West Virginia, and in New York City, and they have been waiting in those two cities for the same researcher for 138 years. Augustus Fair retired from the Customs Service in 1901, 23 years after he began. His retirement letter, in the Treasury Department's personnel files at the National Archives, describes his service without incident and requests his pension at the standard rate for his years of service. It does not mention October 17, 1887. Nothing in his official record mentions October 17, 1887. The official record is complete without it because the official record for that day shows one object, material unknown, forwarded per federal instruction. The instruction was followed. The object was forwarded. The official record is accurate. It says nothing false. It says nothing true about what the object was, where it had come from, or where it went. The personal record says all of that. It is in the Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Columbia University. It has been there since 1963. The library is at 116th Street and Broadway in Manhattan. It is open Monday through Friday. The finding aid for the Fair collection is in the library's online catalog. The appointment form is on the library's website. The October 17th entry is in the journal. The sketch of the markings is in the entry. The 40-minute timing is in the entry. The analysis of what the log notation was designed to accomplish is in the entry.
Augustus Fair understood what had happened and wrote it down and left it in a library in New York City, where it has been waiting for 138 years for the researcher who knows what question to bring to it.